Welcome to this online lecture on the nature of the state. In this lecture, essentially what I want to do in advance of our lecture on the changing character of the British state is to consider the various characteristics of the modern state. Now the problem with this is, as Robert Nandor Burki suggests, everybody agrees that the modern state is a rather baffling phenomenon. So it's important for us, given that the state is such a principal focus of this module, that we try and get to better grips with this institution. We can go a considerable distance in this endeavour if we focus on the famous definition of the state offered by Max Weber. This is a long quote, so I've split it over 2 slides. Weber says, "A compulsory political organisation with continuous operations will be called a state, insofar as its administrative staff successfully upholds the claims to the monopoly of the legitimate use of physical force in the enforcement of its order. The modern state possesses an administrative and legal order subject to change by legislation, to which the organised activities of the administrative staff, which are also controlled by regulations, are orientated." Weber continues, "This system of orders claims binding authority not only over members of the state, the citizens, most of whom have obtained membership by birth, but also to a very large extent over all action taking place in the area of its jurisdiction. It is thus a compulsory organisation with a territorial basis. Furthermore, today the use of force is regarded as legitimate only so far as it is either permitted by the state or prescribed by it. The claim of the modern state to monopolise the use of force is as essential to it as its character of compulsory jurisdiction and continuous operation." Now, as Christopher Pearson in his book from 1996, The Modern State, has noted, the key features which emerge from Weber's definition of the modern state are as follows. Firstly, that it has control over the means of violence. Secondly, territoriality. Thirdly, sovereignty. Fourthly, constitutionality. Fifthly, the notion of impersonal power. 6, public bureaucracy. 7thly, authority and legitimacy. And then finally, citizenship. And what I would now like to do is examine each of these characteristics in turn and consider how they will become the focus of topics which we will encounter later on in the module. The first of these characteristics, control of the means of violence. Weber says that the state successfully upholds the claims to the monopoly of the legitimate use of physical force in the enforcement of its order. Now, physical force is not the sole or the usual means of state administration. Even totalitarian regimes do not govern through physical force alone. Equally, we must recognise that non-state actors may engage in violence despite the monopoly which the state claims. But what Weber is suggesting, however, is that only states have the legitimate right to exercise violence. Those who do use violence, the police, an army and so on, can only do so under the state's dispensation. The second characteristic, territoriality, as Weber puts it, a compulsory organisation with a territorial basis. States are spatially bound entities. They occupy clearly defined physical spaces over which they claim to represent the sole legitimate authority. And as we shall see when we come to look at the Northern Ireland problem, the territorial boundaries of the British state have been a subject of enormous and continuing contention between the Republican and nationalist traditions, who have sought to redraw them, while Unionists and Loyalists have sought to preserve the integrity of the territorial boundaries arrived in 1921. The third characteristic, sovereignty. Weber writes, binding authority not only over members of the state, the citizens, most of whom have obtained membership by birth, but also to a very large extent over all action taking place in the area of its jurisdiction. Now here it's commonly accepted that the modern sovereign state emerged as a consequence of the Peace of Westphalia, which settled the 30 Years' War between 1618 and 1648. And as a consequence of the Peace of Westphalia, this established the principle which allowed individual rulers to adopt and enforce the Christian religion of their choice within his or her sovereign territory. Thereafter, states developed centrally administered institutional machinery for governing what had become by then settled territories. The conception of sovereignty which came to be associated with such states was one in which the state represented the final and absolute political authority in the political community. Such states enjoyed sovereignty internally and externally. They were internally sovereign in that the state became the supreme governing authority over all individuals and groups within its territorial jurisdiction. They were externally sovereign insofar as these states viewed themselves as independent of outside authorities. Now, for some, the concept of state sovereignty has been evacuated of much of its meaning in the modern world. There are those who claim that the state has forfeited its traditional and central role in international politics, becoming one of many international actors, including non-governmental organisations and in particular global corporations. And we shall be revisiting this argument elsewhere in the module, in particular when we come to consider the power of business. The fourth characteristic of constitutionality, as Weber puts it, an administrative and legal order subject to change by legislation. Most modern states are governed, at least formally, by public rules, which are subject to reform by lawful processes, and this stands in contrast to the arbitrary and absolutist forms of governance which had characterised pre-modern states. The fifth characteristic which Weber draws attention to is the rule of law and impersonal power. Related in a way to the characteristic of constitutionality is that the modern state emphasises the rule of law and impersonal power. It is felt that those who exercise power should do so in a way which is lawful and by publicly acknowledged procedures, and in exercising the powers of the state they should not act on a personal basis. However, as we shall see when we come to examine civil liberties towards the end of this module, significant questions can be asked about both the constitutionality and commitment of the British state to the rule of law and the exercise of impersonal power. The sixth characteristic which Weber draws attention to, actually it's the seventh characteristic, made a mistake there, is the use of force being regarded as legitimate. So the notion that the state requires a minimum degree of authority and legitimacy if it is to effectively exercise power is essential to Weber's definition. Now, there are many potential ways in which a state may generate compliance for its actions: tradition, apathy, pragmatic acquiescence, and so on. If it enjoys instrumental acceptance or normative acceptance, it perhaps enjoys a rather greater degree of legitimacy. And this is something which we will consider at a number of points in this module. For example, some would argue that a series of powerful hegemonic ideas have served to guarantee the stability of the UK state. On the other hand, one characteristic of Thatcherism was that she was determined to bolster the state's traditional authority, thereby increasing its legitimacy also in her eyes. Final characteristic which Weber draws attention to is citizenship, or as he writes, members of the state, the citizens, most of whom have obtained membership by birth. So Weber is drawing attention to citizens who enjoy rights which are usually redeemed or protected by the state. And it's also usually the state which decides to whom citizenship is to be granted. Now, the rights of citizenship have changed over time, much as the boundaries and responsibilities of the state have also changed over time. And indeed, these rights of citizenship are subject to ongoing contestation today. Thus, at the beginning of the 21st century, not only do British citizens, at least nominally, enjoy civil and political rights, but also they enjoy social rights, access to social and welfare services, for example. But since the latter part of the 20th century, there has been an increasing focus on the conditionality of those social rights and the need for individuals to fulfil their obligations in return for exercising those rights. Elsewhere, changing expectations of the rights and responsibilities of citizenship have played a particularly important role, as we shall see, in governing the relationship between ethnic minorities and the British state. Formal exclusion of migrants and immigrants from the rights of citizenship remains a powerful factor in British politics. But in addition, since the outbreak of the so-called War on Terror, this has generated new pressures on ethnic minorities to demonstrate their commitment to the values and procedures of the British state. So hopefully focusing on Weber's definition of the state takes us a substantial way away from the bafflement which Burke expressed. But it's useful, I think, to briefly supplement Weber's perspective with an alternative. Ralph Miliband noted that the state is not a thing, it does not as such exist. What the state stands for is a number of particular institutions which together constitute its reality and which interact as parts of what may be called the state system. He continues, These are the institutions: the government, the administration, the military and the police, the judicial branch, subcentral government and parliamentary assemblies, which make up the state. It is in these institutions in which state power lies, and it is through them that this power is wielded in its different manifestations by the people who occupy the leading positions in each of these institutions. Thus, what I think it is particularly important is that as we work our way through this module, is that we recognise that the state is not embodied solely by its elected representatives. We also need to think of it as a broader ensemble of institutions, the majority of which remain unelected, albeit at least nominally under the control of our elected representatives. So this really concludes what I want to say in this online lecture. Thanks for listening and for watching. If you have any questions, please hold them in your mind. We'll have an opportunity to discuss them at the start of the next lecture, which will be focusing much more on the trajectory of the British state and how it has changed over recent political history.